The saddest thing about being invisible is that after a while, even you begin to wonder if anyone would notice if you disappeared. Emma Carter learned that lesson slowly, not through cruelty, not through dramatic heartbreak, through ordinary days. The kind of days that pass so quietly nobody remembers them afterward. Every morning, she arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. She unlocked doors, prepared meeting rooms, organized supplies, and made coffee for volunteers who rarely knew who had set everything up. By 8 o'clock, people filled the building. Parents, students, seniors, staff members. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had someone to talk to. Emma helped all of them. Yet somehow, most people walked past her without really seeing her. It was not intentional. That almost made it worse. When someone ignores you on purpose, at least they made a choice. When they overlook you completely, it feels like you never entered the room at all. One Tuesday afternoon, the center hosted a fundraising event. Emma spent 2 weeks helping organize it. She created schedules, coordinated volunteers, arranged seating, and solved dozens of problems before anyone else knew they existed. When the event ended successfully, the director thanked the planning committee in front of everyone. Applause filled the room. Names were called. Smiles appeared. Emma stood near the back holding a box of leftover supplies. Her name was never mentioned. She did not react. She simply carried the box to storage and continued working. That was what she always did. Later that evening, one of the volunteers found her cleaning tables. "I forgot you were still here," he said casually. Emma smiled. "Most people do." He laughed, assuming she was joking. She let him believe that. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The building gradually emptied until only a handful of people remained. Emma finished her tasks, locked several offices, and headed home. Her apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an aging building on the east side of the city. The elevator had not worked properly in months. She climbed the stairs carrying groceries in one hand and paperwork in the other. On the 2nd floor, she stopped to help an elderly neighbor carry laundry to her apartment. The woman thanked her warmly. Emma smiled and wished her a good evening. Small moments like that happen often. She helped people because it felt natural, not because she expected recognition. If gratitude arrived, she appreciated it. If it did not, she continued anyway. The next morning looked much like the day before. And the day before that. At the community center, conversations happened around her rather than with her. Meetings began without asking for her input. Decisions were made while she quietly handled details nobody else wanted to manage. Yet when something went wrong, people immediately knew where to find her. Emma had become the person everyone depended on and almost nobody noticed. Across the city, in a world completely different from hers, Antonio Russo sat in the back seat of a black sedan waiting for traffic to move. Through the window, he watched people crossing the street beneath gray skies. Business calls filled his morning. Financial reports waited on his phone. Important decisions demanded his attention. Yet for reasons he could not explain, his eyes followed a woman carrying 3 boxes toward a community center entrance. Everyone around her rushed past without slowing down. Nobody offered help. Nobody even looked twice. She adjusted the weight in her arms and kept walking. Antonio watched until the doors closed behind her. Then he glanced away. But something about that brief moment stayed with him. Because while everyone else seemed determined not to notice her, he already had. It was not the first time I had seen her, but it was the first time I could not stop thinking about her afterward. That was the problem with small moments. They did not announce themselves as important. They only became important later, when your mind kept returning to them without permission. I told myself it was nothing. A passing detail. A woman carrying boxes into a building. Something ordinary in a city full of ordinary people. Yet I still asked my driver to slow down the next time we passed that street. I did not explain why. He did not ask. That was the benefit of working with people who understood silence. 2 days later, I found myself reviewing the same location again. This time through a different lens. The community center. Publicly funded. Moderately active. No strategic value to my business operations. No reason for attention. And yet I requested background information anyway. The report arrived that evening. The woman's name was Emma Carter. Age 28. Employment history stable but unremarkable. Multiple community roles. No financial instability severe enough to raise concern, but enough to suggest she was never far from strain. Everything about her profile was ordinary, almost disappointingly so, and still I kept reading. The report included testimonials from staff members and volunteers. Most of them described her in similar ways. Reliable, quiet, helpful, always present, never demanding recognition. That last part appeared repeatedly. Never demands recognition. I read that sentence 3 times before closing the file. It should have meant nothing. In my world, people either wanted attention or avoided it strategically. There was always a motive beneath behavior. But what if there was not? What if someone simply acted without expectation of return? I dismissed the thought immediately. That kind of thinking did not belong in my position. Yet the image of her carrying those boxes returned uninvited. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just persistent. A detail my mind refused to discard. Meanwhile, Emma continued her routine without any awareness of being observed. Her life did not shift suddenly. There were no obvious changes. No signs that anything unusual was happening around her. She still arrived early. Still stayed late. Still handled tasks that others overlooked. Still helped people who did not always notice she was helping them. One afternoon, a scheduling conflict left the community center short-staffed during a large workshop. Participants began arriving earlier than expected. Materials were not fully prepared. There was confusion among volunteers. Emma stepped in without hesitation. She reorganized the room layout, adjusted seating plans, and quietly resolved issues before most people even realized there were problems. Someone asked her how she managed to stay so calm. She simply said she was used to it. No complaint. No explanation. Just acceptance. That sentence should have been forgotten like everything else. Instead, it reached me later that night through a summary note. I paused when I read it. Used to it. People do not usually become used to carrying more than they should. They either break or they ask for help. She had done neither. Across the city, I found myself driving past the same street again without planning to. The community center was still active, lights glowing through tall windows. I did not stop the car this time. I simply watched. Inside I could see movement, people working, conversations happening. And there she was again, moving through the space as if she belonged to every corner of it and none of it at the same time. It was then that I realized something I did not want to admit. I was no longer gathering information for curiosity. I was paying attention. And paying attention in my world always meant something was about to change. The more I paid attention, the more difficult it became to ignore what everyone else seemed willing to accept. Patterns reveal more than moments ever can. One moment can be explained away. A pattern demands an answer. Over the following weeks, I reviewed reports less frequently and observations more often. Not official reports. Human reports. The kind hidden inside ordinary days. Emma arrived before nearly everyone else. She left after most people had gone home. She solved problems quietly. She filled gaps nobody acknowledged. And somehow the people around her had become accustomed to it. Gratitude appeared occasionally, but recognition almost never followed. One Thursday morning, she organized a supply drive for local families. Donations arrived in waves. Volunteers signed forms, moved boxes, and coordinated deliveries. By the end of the afternoon, several community leaders gathered for photographs celebrating the event's success. Emma was not in a single picture. She had spent most of the day unloading vehicles, organizing inventory, and helping families carry supplies to their cars. When the photographs were taken, she was cleaning an empty room nearby. Nobody called her over. Nobody noticed she was missing. Later that evening, I found myself staring at those photographs. Smiling faces filled the frame. The person responsible for half the event did not appear in any of them. I should have closed the file and moved on. Instead, I kept looking. Meanwhile, Emma's life continued exactly as it always had. Her apartment remained modest. Her bank account remained careful. Unexpected expenses still forced difficult decisions. Yet none of that changed the way she treated people. One rainy afternoon, she gave her umbrella to a teenage student walking home through a storm. She spent the next 20 minutes getting soaked while waiting for a bus. The student never learned her name. Emma never expected him to. Another day, she stayed late helping a volunteer finish paperwork, even though she had errands waiting. The volunteer thanked everyone involved afterward except her. Emma simply smiled and wished him a good night. Watching these moments unsettled me more than I expected. Not because they were dramatic, because they were not. Most people reveal themselves when life becomes difficult. Emma revealed herself through consistency. Day after day, choice after choice, kindness without witnesses, effort without applause, responsibility without reward. One evening my driver asked why we kept taking the same route across the city. I looked out the window toward the familiar street before answering. Habit, I said. He nodded. But we both knew it was not habit. By then I could identify the community center from 2 blocks away. I knew when events were scheduled. I knew when volunteer programs happened. I knew far more than I should have. The realization should have concerned me. Instead, it raised a different question. Why had nobody else noticed? Noticed how often she carried burdens that belonged to multiple people. Noticed how many problems disappeared because she handled them before they grew larger. Noticed how frequently she placed everyone else first. The answer arrived unexpectedly one afternoon. People notice. What demands attention? Emma never did. She moved through life quietly. And because she never asked to be seen, the world gradually stopped looking. That understanding stayed with me long after the day ended. Standing beside my office window, watching city lights emerge across the skyline, I realized something important. I was no longer observing her out of curiosity. Curiosity fades. This had not. Every new detail only sharpened my focus. Every overlooked moment made me notice more. Somewhere across the city, Emma Carter was finishing another ordinary day. She believed nobody was paying attention. She was wrong. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was watching closely enough to see everything everyone else missed. It started with a change so subtle that most people would have missed it. The kind of change that does not announce itself. It simply replaces what was there before without asking permission. Over the next few days, small adjustments began appearing around Emma Carter's routine. Nothing dramatic. Nothing visible enough to cause questions. But noticeable enough that someone paying attention would see a pattern forming. One morning, the community center received an updated supply order that included items she had mentioned only once in passing during a casual conversation weeks earlier. Another day, a broken heating system was repaired earlier than scheduled, without the usual waiting period or budget delays. Staff assumed it was administrative efficiency. Emma assumed it was coincidence. I knew better. Because coincidence does not repeat itself with precision. From the office above the city, I reviewed every detail I could access without exposing intent. Emma continued her work unchanged. She still arrived early. Still left late. Still handled responsibilities that belonged to multiple people without complaint. Yet the environment around her was beginning to shift in ways she could not explain. People around her started receiving assistance faster. Requests that normally took weeks were completed in days. Supplies that were often delayed arrived on time. Nothing could be traced directly back to a single decision point. It was clean. Too clean. That level of precision was not accidental. One afternoon, I received a brief internal update from a contact within a logistics network tied indirectly to several community funding channels. It mentioned a series of non-standard prioritizations flagged by automated systems. The report did not contain names. It did not need to. I closed the file immediately. Not because I was finished reading, but because I already understood what it meant. Someone had begun adjusting reality in small increments around a single person. And that someone was me. Meanwhile, Emma remained focused on her daily responsibilities. She never questioned why certain difficulties no longer escalated the way they used to. When a large delivery arrived without error, she simply signed the paperwork and organized distribution. When extra volunteers appeared during understaffed days, she welcomed them without curiosity. She did not look for hidden meaning in improved circumstances. She accepted them the way she accepted everything else in her life, with quiet gratitude and no expectation of explanation. One evening after closing hours, she stayed behind to reorganize a storage room that had been neglected for months. Boxes were labeled incorrectly. Equipment was misplaced. Supplies were scattered across shelves without structure. She worked alone, fixing what others had ignored for too long. The building was empty except for her footsteps and the distant hum of street traffic outside. From a distance, I watched the building again that night. Not physically inside it. Not directly visible. But close enough to understand timing, movement, and presence. She turned off the lights before leaving, locking the door behind her with the same careful routine she always followed. As she walked down the steps, she paused briefly to adjust the strap of a bag on her shoulder. A simple gesture. Unremarkable in every possible way. And yet it stayed with me longer than it should have. Because by then I had stopped analyzing her as a subject. I had started recognizing her as a constant. Something steady in a world that rarely is. That realization carried weight I did not expect. Not because it changed what I was doing, but because it changed why I was doing it. I had entered this pattern thinking I was observing something unusual. Now I understood I was witnessing something far rarer. A person who moved through life without demanding anything from it, and in doing so quietly reshaped everything around her. And the most unsettling part was no longer what I was seeing. It was the fact that I was no longer willing to stop watching. The strange thing about change is that people rarely notice it while it is happening. They only recognize it later, when they look back and realize something feels different. For Emma Carter, the difference arrived quietly. A little less stress here. A little more support there. Small improvements scattered throughout ordinary days. Nothing dramatic enough to attract attention. Yet enough to make life feel slightly lighter than before. One Monday morning, she arrived at the community center expecting another difficult week. Budget concerns had dominated conversations for months. Several outreach programs were operating with limited resources. Volunteers were stretched thin. The usual challenges waited behind every door. Instead, she found something unexpected. A local grant had been approved ahead of schedule. Not a large amount. Not enough to transform the organization overnight. But enough to keep two important programs running through the summer. Staff members celebrated the news enthusiastically. Meetings were called. Plans were adjusted. People congratulated one another. Emma smiled and joined the excitement. Yet nobody noticed that the programs receiving support were the same programs she had spent months trying to protect. Across the city, I reviewed a confirmation report before deleting it permanently. No direct connections. No visible fingerprints. The grant appeared completely legitimate because it was legitimate. It had simply received encouragement from places most people would never see. That was the advantage of influence. The best use of it often looked invisible. Days passed. Then weeks. The pattern continued. Equipment requests moved through approval channels faster than normal. Community partnerships expanded unexpectedly. Volunteer recruitment improved. Every improvement seemed small on its own. Together they created momentum. Emma noticed the results but never searched for a source. She remained focused on the work itself. One afternoon, she sat with a group of students participating in an after-school literacy program. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Several children had struggled to attend consistently because transportation had always been unreliable. Recently that problem had disappeared. A local organization had stepped forward to help. Emma listened as the students talked excitedly about books, school projects, and future plans. Watching them smile made her smile too. She never considered how many separate decisions had been adjusted behind the scenes to make moments like that possible. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening to me as well. The more I observed her, the less interested I became in outcomes and the more interested I became in her reactions. Not because she was extraordinary in the way most people define extraordinary. Quite the opposite. She never treated improvements as personal victories. She never acted entitled to good fortune. When something positive happened, she immediately focused on who else would benefit. That perspective had become increasingly rare in my experience. One evening, a senior staff member at the community center publicly thanked several employees for recent successes. Emma's name was mentioned briefly before attention shifted elsewhere. Most people would have been disappointed. Most people would have wanted more recognition. Emma looked genuinely grateful for the small acknowledgement and returned to work. The simplicity of that response stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Later that night, standing alone beside the windows of my office, I watched city lights spread across the horizon. Thousands of people moving through thousands of separate lives. Most of them chasing attention, chasing status, chasing validation. Yet the person occupying my thoughts wanted none of those things. She simply kept showing up every day and doing what needed to be done. For the first time I began to understand why I could not look away. It was not because Emma Carter was demanding to be seen. It was because she never demanded it at all. And somehow that made her impossible to ignore. It became impossible to deny that something intentional was happening. Not in a loud or obvious way. There were no announcements. No direct messages. No visible source of authority stepping forward to claim responsibility. Instead, the changes around Emma Carter's life continued in the same quiet rhythm they had always followed. Subtle adjustments. Corrected problems. Opportunities arriving slightly earlier than expected. Barriers disappearing just before they became obstacles. From the outside, her life still looked ordinary. She still arrived at the community center before opening hours. She still organized materials, assisted visitors, and stayed late to complete unfinished work. But within that ordinary structure, the weight she had carried for years began to feel slightly lighter. One morning, she noticed that a long-delayed equipment repair had finally been completed without her submitting another request. She paused briefly, reading the confirmation notice twice, as if expecting it to change. It did not. She simply nodded to herself and continued her work. There was no suspicion in her reaction, only quiet acceptance, as though life occasionally improved for reasons that did not require explanation. That same day, I received an updated internal summary of recent adjustments, linked to multiple community support channels. The language in the report was careful, neutral, and deliberately nonspecific. It confirmed what I already understood without stating it directly. Resources were being guided. Processes were being influenced. Priorities were being quietly reshaped, all without triggering formal alerts. It was not corruption. It was not misuse. It was something more precise. Controlled discretion. And it all pointed back to a single focus. Her. Meanwhile, Emma continued interacting with people exactly as she always had. During a small afternoon workshop, a volunteer accidentally knocked over a stack of supplies. Several items scattered across the floor. Before anyone could react, Emma was already helping pick them up. She did not express frustration. She did not draw attention to the mistake. She simply restored order and smiled reassuringly at the volunteer, who apologized repeatedly. Her response was calm, almost instinctive, as if maintaining stability in small moments was simply part of her nature. Watching this pattern repeated across different situations began to shift something in my perspective. It was no longer about what I could change in her environment. It was about what she chose to remain unchanged within herself. Despite receiving less than she gave, despite being acknowledged less than she contributed, she continued without hesitation. No resentment, no withdrawal, no demand for balance. One evening I found myself reviewing footage from a community event she had helped organize weeks earlier. Not for investigation, not for verification, simply observation. In nearly every frame she was positioned slightly outside focus, helping someone in the background, adjusting something off to the side, ensuring everything functioned while rarely occupying the center of attention. It was not accidental. It was consistent. That consistency created a realization I did not expect. Most people try to be seen. They adjust their behavior, their presence, their voice. They compete for attention in ways both subtle and obvious. Emma did none of that. She existed fully without attempting to be noticed at all. And yet, paradoxically, that was exactly what made her impossible to overlook. Later that night, I stood again at my office window. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with movement and noise and constant demand for attention. But my focus remained fixed on one quiet point within it. A woman who had never asked for anything, never demanded recognition, never attempted to influence anyone beyond simple kindness. And still, without intention, she had begun to alter everything around her. I finally understood the truth I had been circling for weeks. This was no longer about observation. It was about involvement. And once that line is crossed, There is no returning to distance. The first time our paths truly crossed, neither of us understood how important the moment would become. It happened on a Saturday afternoon during a community partnership event held at the center. Several local organizations had gathered to discuss future programs, volunteer initiatives, and educational opportunities. Normally, I would have delegated attendance to someone else. Instead, I arrived personally. I told myself it was because the event mattered. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. It was also incomplete. Emma spent the morning moving between meeting rooms, coordinating schedules, greeting visitors, and solving problems before they became visible. By now I could predict the rhythm of her day. Someone would forget materials. Emma would find them. Someone would arrive confused. Emma would guide them. Something would need attention. Emma would handle it. The pattern had become almost familiar. What I did not expect was for her to notice me. The main conference room filled gradually. Conversations echoed across the space. People exchanged introductions and business cards. I remained near the back, speaking only when necessary. Then, as she crossed the room carrying a stack of folders, her eyes met mine briefly. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Nothing more. Yet something shifted. Not recognition. Not understanding. Simply awareness. For the first time, I was no longer observing from a distance completely outside her world. I existed within it. Emma offered a polite smile, the same smile she gave everyone. Warm, professional, genuine. Then she continued walking. The interaction should have been insignificant. Instead, I found myself watching the doorway she had disappeared through. Across the room, Emma experienced something equally unusual. She could not explain why the man near the back had caught her attention. The city was full of successful people, wealthy people, influential people. Yet there was something different about him. Not arrogance. Not performance. Stillness. He seemed to notice everything while drawing attention to nothing. Several hours later, the event concluded successfully. Volunteers began cleaning up. Guests prepared to leave. Emma stayed behind, helping organize equipment and paperwork. Most attendees had already gone home when she noticed a folder left behind beneath one of the chairs. Without thinking, she picked it up and headed toward the exit. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the parking lot in long golden lines. She spotted the same man walking toward a black sedan. "Excuse me," she called. I turned. She approached holding the folder. "I think this belongs to you." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I accepted it. "Thank you." Her smile appeared again. Simple. Effortless. "You are welcome." Most conversations begin with questions. Ours did not. The silence that followed felt strangely comfortable. Finally, Emma glanced toward the community center. "I hope the event was useful." "It was," I replied honestly. "You organized it well." A faint look of surprise crossed her face. Not because of the compliment, because someone had noticed. "Thank you," she said softly. The words lingered between us. Then a volunteer called her name from inside the building. Emma turned instinctively toward the voice, responsibility pulling her back once again. Before leaving, she looked at me one final time. "Have a good evening." Then she walked away. I watched until she disappeared through the doors. For most people, it would have been a forgettable exchange lasting less than a minute. But as my driver pulled away from the curb, I realized something had changed. Distance had become familiarity. Observation had become connection. And for the first time since this began, Emma Carter was no longer just someone I noticed. She had become someone I wanted to know. After that evening, I told myself the interaction meant nothing. That was the logical interpretation. A brief exchange at the end of a public event. A polite conversation between two people who would likely never intersect again. In my world, that should have been the end of it. But logic does not always silence attention. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the community center more often than necessary. Not inside. Not directly. I simply passed by. Observed. Noted timing. Noted patterns. Emma's routine remained unchanged. She arrived early. She left late. She helped without hesitation. Yet now I noticed things I had previously overlooked. The way she always paused before entering a room. as if mentally preparing herself to absorb whatever problems waited inside. The way she listened to people fully, even when they did not listen to her in return. The way she seemed to understand responsibility as something that did not require acknowledgement to be real. One afternoon, I received a report that required my attention downtown. The route took me directly past the center. I did not schedule it that way intentionally. At least that is what I told myself. As my car slowed at a traffic light, I saw her outside speaking with an elderly man near the entrance. He was struggling with a walker. She adjusted her pace to match his. She never rushed him, never signaled impatience. She simply matched his rhythm as if his time mattered as much as hers. When he finally entered the building safely, she held the door open until he was fully inside. Then she stepped back and continued her day without ceremony. The light turned green. My driver asked if we should proceed. I did not answer immediately. Then I said yes. That evening I reviewed something I had not planned to revisit. Internal notes. Observational summaries. Small details gathered over time. Nothing official. Nothing meant for decision-making. Just patterns. One line repeated itself in different forms across multiple entries. Emma Carter consistently prioritizes others before herself without external prompting or reward. It was written as a neutral observation, but reading it now it no longer felt neutral. It felt incomplete, because it did not explain why. People often behave generously for recognition, or obligation, or expectation of return, but she did not. That absence of motive created something I could not categorize easily. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple. Too simple for the frameworks I normally use to understand human behavior. Meanwhile, Emma remained unaware of any observation beyond the immediate world around her. That afternoon, she attended a small planning session for an upcoming literacy drive. Several participants debated resource allocation. Voices rose slightly. Opinions conflicted. Emma listened quietly before offering a single suggestion that resolved the disagreement without drawing attention to herself. The group accepted it. The discussion moved forward. No one paused long enough to ask how she had arrived at the answer. Later that day, she cleaned the meeting room alone after everyone had left. Chairs were stacked. Papers organized. Tables wiped down. She worked methodically without distraction. It should have been ordinary. And yet, I found myself thinking about it longer than necessary. That night, I stood again at the window of my office. The city stretched beneath me, illuminated in endless motion. Somewhere within that network of lights was a woman who continued to exist without demanding recognition, yet somehow made her presence felt in every place she touched. I had begun this observation without intention. Curiosity had been enough at first. But curiosity had quietly transformed into something else. Not possession, not control, something closer to understanding. And understanding, once it begins, does not remain passive for long. The truth did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most important truths do, through small details that eventually became impossible to ignore. For Emma Carter, the first sign appeared during a quarterly review meeting at the community center. Funding numbers had improved. Volunteer participation had increased. Several programs once considered at risk were now operating more successfully than anyone had predicted. Staff members celebrated the progress. The director praised teamwork. Everyone seemed pleased by the results. Yet as Emma listened, a quiet question settled into the back of her mind. Why had so many separate problems begun solving themselves at the same time? She did not voice the thought. She simply carried it with her. Days later, another clue appeared. A partner organization mistakenly forwarded an internal document to the center. It was not confidential, but it contained information Emma had never seen before. Several recently approved grants traced back through the same network of charitable foundations and development groups. She recognized some of the names immediately. Others were unfamiliar. One name, however, stood out. Russo Foundation Initiatives. Emma stared at the page longer than necessary. The name felt familiar. Not because she had researched it, but as she had heard it recently. At a community event. In a conversation. Attached to a man whose presence had lingered in her thoughts more than she cared to admit. She closed the document and told herself it meant nothing. Yet the question remained. Across the city, I already knew the distance between observation and discovery was shrinking. Reports confirmed it. Patterns confirmed it. Most importantly, my own instincts confirmed it. Emma was beginning to connect pieces that had remained separate for months. I should have prepared a response. Instead, I found myself strangely calm, because somewhere along the way, the outcome had become less important than the reason behind it. A week later, another community event brought our paths together again. The gathering was smaller this time. Fewer organizations. Fewer attendees. A quieter atmosphere. Emma arrived carrying folders and schedules. I arrived carrying responsibilities that had nothing to do with the event and everything to do with seeing her again. We spoke briefly at first. Simple conversation. Nothing remarkable. Yet it felt easier than before. Familiar. As though the distance between our worlds had narrowed without either of us noticing. Then Emma asked a question. Do you work with community organizations often? The words were casual. Her eyes were not. I paused before answering. Sometimes. She studied me for a moment. Not suspicious. Curious. Thoughtful. Then she nodded. The conversation continued, but something had changed. For the first time, she was not simply seeing me. She was trying to understand me. Later that evening, after the event ended, Emma remained behind helping clean up. The sun had already disappeared. Soft lights illuminated the nearly empty parking lot outside. She stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a box of leftover materials. I happened to be leaving at the same time. This time, neither of us seemed eager to rush away. The silence between us felt comfortable. Finally, Emma spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Why do I get the feeling you notice things other people do not? The question landed with more weight than she realized. For a moment, the city seemed unusually quiet. Then I smiled slightly. Not because the answer was complicated, because it was simple. Maybe because most people are looking for what is loud, I said. And I learned a long time ago that the important things are usually quiet. Emma held my gaze. Something passed between us then. Not a confession. Not a revelation. Just understanding. Partial but growing. As she walked away moments later, I remained where I was, watching the lights of the city beyond the street. The truth was closer now than ever before. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer worried about what would happen when Emma finally understood. Because the reason behind everything had never changed. Everyone else had overlooked her. I simply could not.